But this one is really interesting in its own ways. There are some things that may be a little bit dry, but decision making as a whole, a lot of what this lecture is about is stuff that kind of occurs at the individual level too. We go through the same processes when we make decisions in our own life, but that kind of gets magnified when we put a bunch of people together. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that we're a lot better at making decisions when we're in groups of people, because we can bounce ideas off of each other, we can explore different ideas. But a lot of what we're also going to talk about, that's kind of the portion of this that I really like, is polarization. So we'll talk about how when we get into groups and we start having discussions, that we tend to end up in a position where the group takes a really extreme position on something that probably wouldn't have been there if it was just a bunch of individuals. And we'll look at how that kind of leads to groupthink type stuff too. So today's lecture, I was kind of hinting at some of this before we got started. First, we're going to look at kind of what the decision stages are. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this is something that's very similar when you think about making decisions in your own life. There's this orientation phase, which is really about identifying the problems and gathering information. And then there's the discussion phase, which is more group oriented. That's about really looking at all of the things that you've collected, discussing what the best thing to do is, then you make the decision, and then you implement the decision. And so we'll go through kind of each of those in turn. But then we'll look at kind of what gets in the way of good group decision making, and how this leads into these really interesting group processes of polarization and these really kind of insidious, detrimental ones of groupthink. And we'll look at how groupthink arises and like the symptoms that are there to identify when it's there, because it's really hard to know when you're in a group that's like suffering from this. It's this double-edged sword that cohesion creates. Cohesion is something we've talked about all term as being this really good thing, unless you end up in this kind of groupthink category where it can actually turn into a really bad thing. So when we're talking about decision making in general, we're talking about kind of gathering and analyzing and weighing information, discussing it with other people so that we can come to a conclusion as a team. I mean, this is a big part of kind of upper echelon managerial type positions when you get out into the working world. And a lot of the research shows that we're a lot better at making decisions when we're with other people. And we'll kind of talk about what leads to that. But a lot of it is that we have a lot more resources to pull from, a lot of different perspectives to look at. And so from the research, they've shown like physicians are better at making diagnoses when they're consulting with other physicians. I think that artificial intelligence is going to surpass all of that. I remember some diagnosis that I had. It took me like so many doctors to get to, and then I plugged symptoms into an AI machine and it knew in like 5 minutes. Like, yeah. So a lot of this is something we've talked about before, this forming more accurate perceptions. This is kind of the wisdom of the crowd effect, that when you ask a lot of people about something, you tend to get a better indication of what the actual thing is. And then this down here at the bottom too is something you can probably relate to, is that students are actually a lot better at taking tests when you can take them together. Everybody kind of knows the information a little bit differently. And I think a lot of that is because we tend to integrate the information in a self-relevant way. So some portions of what we learn may be more meaningful to me than they are to you because of your experiences, because of your goals, all of that. And when you put people together, you can kind of combine all of that stuff and really bring it all out. So the actual phases, and we'll kind of look at these each on their own. It's something I've kind of hinted at a couple of times already, but the orientation phase is the first one, and this tends to be the one that's the most overlooked. People don't really spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the problems are. They often just sweep them under the rug and don't talk about them. Whenever you bring up planning with people, people cringe. But it's really important as a group to really put yourself in those uneasy situations where you're trying to identify the problems that you're facing and setting goals and trying to come up with plans. The discussion phase is when you're kind of gathering all of the information and really weighing all of that information, and having a discussion about it to consider all of the alternative options. Then the group kind of comes up with a solution, and so there's a lot of different ways, and we'll talk about each of these, that you can actually reach a decision. So someone can just unilaterally just say, we're going to do this. You can vote. You can use kind of delegation type techniques. So we'll look at a bunch of different ones there. But the last one, probably the most important one, doesn't matter if you've done any of this if you don't actually put it into action. And that's one we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but it's kind of the most intuitive. Kind of doesn't make sense to do all of this if you're not actually going to do something about the problem. But you'd be surprised how many people spend time doing the first three and then don't actually do anything. And you could probably relate that to your own life, how there's a lot of stuff that you talk about wanting to do that you never actually do. Action is important. So this is the one that I talked about as being something that people really try to avoid, honestly. It's all about kind of clarifying what our goals are, what kind of resources do we have, but most importantly, it's about identifying like what the actual problems are, what the obstacles are that we're facing with these goals that we're trying to achieve, and what are the actual procedures that we're all going to kind of agree on to work towards all of these goals. And so this is a very kind of heavy cognitive type stage of decision making where you really have to put a lot of work in to come up with and to figure out what all of these different things are, right? And so by the end of it, you should know kind of what the purpose of this discussion should be in general, like what the target is, what the problem is. You should know about kind of what the procedures are that you're going to implement to try to work towards that goal, and what kind of tasks really kind of those, you can think of the tasks as kind of the sub-goals that are going to get you to that overall target that you have. And so what the research shows, and this is kind of obvious when you think about it, is that so many people skip this stage. And the research says if you skip this stage, you tend to make really bad decisions. And this is in our own lives too. A lot of us don't spend a lot of time planning. We don't spend a lot of time really thinking out what all of the obstacles are that we're going to face, and we kind of just flow through our life and just have things hit us as they are. And so it's really important to really take that time to identify where it is you need to go and what steps you need to take to get there. But most people, when you bring up the idea of having a planning session, it's like, can we just like do our job? It's not something many people enjoy engaging in. Even in our just own decision-making processes, it's really intense cognitively. It takes a lot of resources to go through this stuff. So if you get through that stage, then you have a lot more to discuss, right? So you can discuss without planning and doing all of these things, but if you go to the discussion without planning, you're usually just talking about things that everybody already knows already. You're just sharing kind of known information instead of really working towards something new and something creative. But the really cool thing about making decisions and discussing things in groups is that there's a lot better memory for information because there's more perspectives, there's more people. Everybody has a different kind of connection to the information that you're talking about, right? There's a lot more information exchange, so you can piggyback ideas off of each other and combine things and be creative. And this kind of more thorough processing of information kind of fits in with all of that. Is that you're really kind of working together to put all of that into kind of a cohesive whole. But this whole idea of better memory is this collective memory, right? You have everybody's cognitive resources all kind of pooled together, working towards the same goal. The research has shown though that even though there is kind of a better memory for everything because everybody is kind of taking a little bit from their own perspective, that it is still really helpful to have someone kind of recording like key moments of the meetings and like key ideas. And this is especially the case if what you're doing isn't something that's going to be implemented for a while. I mean, you've probably all been engaged in a project where you're like, you know everything that you're doing, but then you put it down and you come back to it like a month later and you're just like, what the hell? Like, where was I? What is this? So it's really, really helpful to have comments, to have things that show you where you were, why you made the decisions that you did. And what often happens is that individuals that have a particular skill, that are really good at something, are usually relied on to remember information about that skill, right? And this totally makes sense when we think about this in terms of psychology, when we think about the brain. We remember things that are self-relevant. This is something I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. But I study the self, I study the brain, and this is something that's like a huge, huge finding in psychology, is that when you give people memory tests, they remember things that are somehow connected to them. And that's a really good skill for all of you to have. is when you're trying to learn things and you're trying to get through class, you need to define how that's meaningful to you to actually make sense of it. But all of this discussion it proceeds really well. It's really successful when there's a lot of encouragement, when people are being supported through it, are being encouraged to share, encouraged to be committed to the process, which is, again, a lot of this is very intuitive, but it's nice to spell it out so that you can have something to draw on when you're actually in one of these situations. So the actual decision phase can be done in a bunch of different ways. And this was something I was hinting at earlier, because when we finally come to a point where we've weighed all of these options, who makes the decision? Does the group make the decision? Does the leader make the decision? There's a lot of different ways this can happen, right? So delegation is when an individual or a clique or subgroup is relied on to just make that decision, right? And a lot of the times this can be done without discussion. This can be done with or without group input, right? This is something that usually happens with tasks that aren't very important. It's just like I don't care, just make the decision. Averaging decisions are ones where you're going around asking everybody, what do you think we should do? Taking a poll, seeing where everybody lands. But the problem with averaging, and I think we talk about problems on the next one, but you could end up with really extreme opinions on both sides, and then you end up doing something that's in the middle that nobody's really satisfied with. These tend to be the best ones, is when you do plurality, which is defining some majority percentage. But here you're also going to have people that feel alienated, that feel let down. And these ones are the toughest. And we've talked about a lot of these before in previous lectures. But these ones take a lot of time to discuss to get everybody on the same page. But they tend to be things that everybody buys into at the end because everybody feels like they had some input. So pros and cons, I just mentioned some of them. But the delegation one is one that's going to save a lot of time. And this is why we tend to rely on this, especially in managerial type positions. I know with my research team, I've gotten to a point where I'm able to delegate a lot more, and it feels really nice to not have to make decisions about everything. It's something that you have to let go a little bit as a leader in these types of situations, and there has to be some level of trust, some level of cohesion for you to be able to actually pass that decision on to someone else and trust that they're going to make the right one, right? But if you are constantly making decisions for other people, then without getting a lot of input, that can leave people feeling like they're ignored, like they don't have a say, like what they feel is important isn't being recognized or appreciated. And then with the averaging, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is something that gets brought up a lot in politics and things like that when we talk about compromises across the aisle or whatever, is that a lot of the times it leads to this arbitrary middle ground that's not really a solution either way. It's just this averaging together. It would be really nice if everybody landed in the middle already. But if you end up in a case where half of your group really doesn't want to do it and half of your group really does, and then you take some weird middle ground, nobody's satisfied. You know what I mean? And so this can lead to really arbitrary ideas and decisions. And voting ends up in a similar situation, especially if the vote is close. You can think about this in terms of politics too, is that half of the country is usually really upset with what's going on, right? This is really nice when the vote is not close and when there's a really strong majority that's leaning in one direction. But one of the things that really comes out of voting in general, especially in the workplace, in smaller groups, is that you end up with these really intense internal politics where the voting itself isn't really about individual preferences anymore. It's about what group you belong to. People form voting block coalitions. You can think of Survivor. It's all about that, right? It's about forming these coalitions and these voting blocks together. And it's all because of the pressure and the influence that these other people are putting on people, trading favors. If you vote my way, then I'm going to do something for you. And so a lot of the times you can get very abstracted away from what the vote was about in the first place. And the vote becomes meaningless at that point if it's all just being driven by these internal politics and coalitions. And that's where the pressure can become really insidious, honestly. And you feel very disenfranchised when you're in a coalition that you don't necessarily agree with, but you have to go along with it. So unanimous was one that I was mentioning. It's really time intensive because you really have to put in a lot of effort to convince everybody, to get everybody on the same page. But because you've gotten input, because everybody has had some type of a say, you have really high levels of commitment. People are on board for what we're deciding to do. And this is usually the best tactic to take with moral dilemmas about taking a stance on public issues, on saying like, where do we fall on like relating this back to the pandemic, thinking about mask wearing in the workplace, things like that, really taking into account everybody's preferences, everybody's anxieties, and coming to a solution that everybody can kind of get on board with. So, and then implementation is usually leaves people feeling satisfied if there has been some type of procedural justice. If everybody feels like the decision was made in the group's best interest, that it wasn't the leader just making a selfish decision, that the processes that led to that decision were ones that were well thought out, that there was actually planning that went into it, then you tend to have people that are on board. And so these are just some nice examples of what creates satisfaction around decision making, right? So we want something that's done consistently. So they're kind of going through the same procedure, the same type of delegation, the same type of whatever over and over. There's no self-interest, so people are not doing this because they're gaining something out of it, but it's for the group's best interest. That it's being done based on accurate information. That one seems really obvious, but in the real world, it's not. Is that a lot of the times we go on kind of biased and not statistical, factual information. And we need to consider alternatives. We need opportunities to correct the decision, right? Everybody needs to feel represented, and it needs to be done in a way that everybody feels good about it, that it was viewed as being moral and ethical. So this is interesting. The word normative here should ring some bells because this is this idea of societal norms. This is what we've come to be really familiar with. So when we see decisions being made like this is something that is inherent in our society. It's a structure of our society. And so oftentimes we're okay with a leader kind of solving and making the decision himself and announcing it to the group. That's something that we just kind of feel is normal because that's what leaders do, right? That's how our groups naturally work. There's often the time that individuals are consulted by these leaders. So the leader goes and kind of talks to individuals within the group and then still makes the decision. You'll notice that a lot of these revolve around the leader making the decision and not the group making the decision. But there are also cases that we find normal, that the leader will kind of discuss all of this with the group and then makes the decision. And what you'll notice here is that even though the leader is kind of consulting individuals and consulting the group, we still feel like it's normal for the leader to make a decision based on like his own preferences, right? So even though he talked with people or talked with the group, if he makes a decision that's kind of not in accordance with what the group said, that's still something that we kind of accept because it's how our groups over time have worked. But we're starting to see a lot of these norms kind of shift towards something a little bit more facilitative, a little bit more inclusive, where they're kind of leading more of a group-centered collaboration around analyzing and discussing these problems. And this is something that we'll talk about later, is a big tactic that's kind of known in managerial circles now about the leader not really talking about their own preferences and their own biases and pushing the group in a certain direction. And so they're not adopting a particular solution, they're letting the group kind of figure things out and then kind of going with that. And then the last one is one that's really rare, especially in the corporate world, is this idea of delegating to the group itself. I mean, I say that it's really rare in terms of like important decisions. This is actually very common in terms of really kind of low-level, unimportant type decisions. But the group can kind of make a decision without the leader being there. Cool. All right, cool. So we'll get into this is where it starts getting into some of the interesting stuff, because these are the biases that we can start to recognize in ourselves. We can start to really combat and think about when we're in these group situations. And there's this really interesting thing that comes out in the literature and the research, that oftentimes in these discussions, in these groups, there's more misunderstanding than there is understanding. It takes skilled communication to get people on the same page. There's a lot of brain research that actually shows that like our brains start firing the same way when we're on the same page and when we understand each other, and facilitating that is not super easy to do. They show in classrooms that when your brain is firing the same way as the teacher, that you get better scores on the test. Yeah, it's crazy.
Being on the same way.
Yeah,
Trying to make eye contact with you the whole time.
right? And there's not a lot of there's like kind of the chicken or the egg with that. It's like, are our brains firing the same way because we just naturally come to that same conclusion, or is there something about the interaction that's like causing our brains to fire that way? Yeah, they show that like when guitar players play with each other, that their brains sync up. Cool stuff. Anyway, back to decision making. These are ones that, so these are some of the biases, some of the things that you should really start to think about in your own life, in the way that you are sitting down and listening to people. These are really bad listening habits. And I think all of us fall prey to this all the time, especially when our cognitive resources are low or whatever. Leveling is a big one, right? So someone is telling you some story that has a lot of nuance, that there's a lot of different elements kind of coming into play, but what you're hearing is this really simple shortened version of that, where all the nuance kind of goes out the window. And it often falls kind of into the same category as the sharpening, is that you end up focusing on the really kind of distinct elements and you make it seem like that's what the entire thing was about, right? You ignore all those little idiosyncrasies and focus on kind of the really negative things or the really positive things, and none of the gray area. And this is a big one down here. Assimilation is that we tend to hear what we want to hear, right? We have our own beliefs, we have our own expectations about what we think you are trying to tell me. And so even if you're saying something completely different, I'm hearing that you agree with me, I'm hearing that we're on the same page. This is huge in conflict. A lot of these bad listening habits are what lead to conflict, where you're on the same page probably, but you're not communicating right, you're not listening right, and you're not really confirming with one another that you're actually trying to solve the same thing. And so these are the 7 basic categories kind of that come out in the literature.
7 deadly sins.
The 7 deadly sins of listening. Right, and a lot of it falls on you as the active listener, right? It plays into these communication skills about whether or not you're actually listening well or not, how much you are, this kind of assimilation idea, how much you're engaging in this egocentric type bias, this self-bias, and whether or not you just don't care, right? Non-participation, failure to focus, those are going to be reasons that you're not understanding what's trying to be said. Interruptions tend to break the flow of things and stop the communication from being fluent. And then there's also just kind of these perceptual elements here about the leader, about kind of the attitude or the emotion of the room. All of these things can really affect how a message is interpreted. And so the other side of this, we have all of these bad listening habits and these bad kind of communication skills, but we're also just really good at kicking the can down the road and not ever actually trying to solve the big problems that our group faces, that we personally face in our own lives. Procrastination's a huge one, right? I'll get to it sometime. This is my favorite part of academia. I have colleagues that will talk about how much they love how flexible our job is and how like there's not these like really hard deadlines or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But the other side of that is that nothing gets done. It's like, oh yeah, well, it doesn't need to get done right now. So we'll publish a paper in like 3 years. Like, So a lot of this is, yeah, you're not really engaging in it. You're not trying to look at alternatives. You're just kind of kicking it down the road. This one is a really, really big one. So a lot of the times when we're in these situations where we need to make a decision in our own lives, if we're making a decision as a group, then we tend to try to say, like, look at all these good things that are going to happen. Look at all this money we're going to make. And then you don't talk at all, or you completely minimize like all of the obstacles, all of the bad things that can happen. Like, oh, but what about like all of those trees in the rainforest that we're cutting down, or like the negative impact on all of the people in this neighborhood, or whatever it is. But we're going to make a lot of money. Like, but even in our own lives, like making some decision about taking a job in another country, and it's like, oh, that sounds so cool and all of these things, but then you don't think about being away from family and being away from friends. And not that traveling to another country wouldn't be amazing, but it's just kind of a bias that we end up in. So muddling through. So this is one where you're kind of sweeping everything under the rug. All of those big problems that are those other options that are there that should be considered. Instead, you just kind of come up with these like really close alternatives to what you're already doing. Like, we don't really need to change that policy completely. Let's just like tweak the wording a little bit to make everybody happy, and not really think about the fact that we should probably like overhaul our entire approach to like drug policy or whatever it may be. Whatever it is. Yeah. I'm like in addiction land lately, so it's like the fact that we're taking a bunch of traumatized people and sticking them in a cage and traumatizing them even further and expecting that they're going to learn their lesson or something is bizarre. Yeah. So satisficing is this nice made-up word in the group literature literature. So it's like, you know what, this works, so let's just kind of go with it. It's taking this kind of low-risk approach, not really considering all of these hard things that we have to face, or not really, I mean, this really kind of ties into what we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture with the orientation phase, is that we're not really spending time in the planning phase. We're not identifying our needs. We're not considering options. We're not coming up with good processes and good procedures. We're just saying like, yeah, this is kind of working, so let's just go with it. So I think this one and bolstering, trivializing and bolstering are the big ones in society, is that we tend to really focus on the kind of minor things, the little tiny things that we can change to make everyone happy, and just completely kind of sweep all of the larger, more important stuff under the rug. And this is why nothing ever gets done. Right? It's rare to find groups that are actively engaging in combating this, right? Because when you push people, when you really try to get people to go into these different realms and to consider these different options, it's really anxiety-inducing, and we tend to avoid that as much as possible. A lot of it is really having a good facilitator, someone that can get a group discussion going and can leave their own personal bias out of the way, and can actually encourage the planning phase. And a lot of it too is what we're going to kind of get into next too, is encouraging these environments where people feel safe to share the information that they have, that you don't have this really high pressure to conform where everybody's afraid to come up with alternative ways of doing things. Because you got to think, like, a lot of what this is saying is like, we don't want to rock the boat, right? Because that's what really needs to happen in a lot of these cases. And like, think about being a low-level employee that's like, hey, we should like consider this. Like, most of this is coming from the top down, right? You have all these managers that are like, well, this is the way that we do it. And you have these other people that are like, there's a way better way to do this, but I'm afraid to bring any of this up, because you're not going to want to engage, you're not going to want to go down this route, you're not going to want to consider alternatives. So there's a lot that you have to combat there. So there are interventions, but a lot of them are based on having good leadership, having good facilitation of discussions that kind of recognize this and combat it right at the beginning. And this one's really interesting. So when you're in a group, you tend to focus on information that everybody already knows. So the conversation, and you can kind of think about your normal life. This is something my wife and I have to combat every once in a while. We'll like sit there and we'll be like, whoa, let's talk about something else, because we've talked about this like every night for the past week and a half. Right? Same things over and over and over again, but it's easy because you know that other person knows that they care about that, and it's an easy kind of introduction into conversation and into kind of a discussion. And so when you're talking about new and novel things, there's a lot of kind of uncertainty there. There's a lot of ambiguity there, right? But there's really harmful consequences, and this kind of gets into groupthink that we'll get into later, when this unshared information doesn't actually get out there. But what you see is that this is really, really strong when people are working on these really ambiguous things where there's no kind of right or correct solution. So a lot of the times people aren't willing to really kind of take a step out of the norm, and so they're just kind of going with what everybody already knows and what everybody's already talking about, kind of the group opinion and the group consensus. But this tends to kind of disappear if there's a strong emphasis on making the best decision, making the right decision, right? Making it clear that we will have a correct and a good solution at the end of this, and we're going to work through this until we do. Then you start to encourage people to kind of open up, to share what they think that might be different than what we've been talking about already. But this was really interesting. That when I came across this, it made me think a little bit that a lot of the times in these situations, the people that are sharing information that everybody knows already are often doing that because it makes them look more competent and knowledgeable. It's like, look, I know what you guys know. Like me. Right? It's all about making this good impression. It's like showing that you're on the same page, that you have the same opinions, that you have the same biases, the same prejudice as these other people. It makes you look like an in-group member. And so when you end up in these situations where the cohesion gets really strong, the pressure to conform gets really strong, is when this starts to become a lot more common, that you don't have people offering up different solutions. So there are interventions for this kind of stuff. So this is, like I said, a lot of this has to do with good facilitation. And that you really want to encourage people to not just have the same discussion over and over again. It takes insight, right? You have to be in that moment like, okay, we're having the same conversation we've had 10 times. Like, let's move this on. Let's consider some alternatives and some different opinions, some different perspectives. And so it takes this intervening that a lot of the times is uncomfortable. Right? I mean, even in the situation I mentioned earlier with my wife, there's that moment where you like call it out, and it almost feels like ooh, like, do we have to talk about this again? Right? It's uncomfortable. It's anxiety-inducing, and so it takes someone that has a lot of confidence to really push the group into this direction, to really intervene and get them to start sharing stuff that they haven't shared before. But this is a big one too, is that time tends to fix this as well. If you spend more time in discussion, then you tend to start sharing more information. The discussion starts taking a different direction, and the unshared information starts to come out. And so these are just some other ones that the research has identified. And so having a group that has diversity in it, I mean, this is a big hiring thing right now in the world. They have, I mean, the university, the psychology department has a whole diversity hire, like faculty appointment. And so a lot of this is, these ideas and this research is driving new approaches in hiring, in kind of forming diverse teams that allow for this kind of shared bias to disappear. Using an advocacy approach would be kind of, if I don't trip and die before I finish the lecture, it's kind of this encouraging thing. It's like kind of being an advocate for someone, or encouraging people to advocate for themselves, so that they feel comfortable, they feel safe sharing this kind of stuff. But a big part of this too, I mean, this all comes back to, like I said, whoever's leading these discussions, whoever's facilitating a lot of this, is that you really need to make a point that we want to hear dissent, right? We want to hear opinions that aren't ours. And this one is just kind of a really good one to think of, like The Office, the Dunder Mifflin discussion meetings that are like the same thing every single time, right? You really need to actually come together as a group with an agenda item and say, like, look, we are talking about something specific. We are trying to solve something new, instead of just calling a group meeting and then having the same discussion that you've had 10 times. So these ones, I mean, this is my jam here. These like cognitive stuff that goes on. A lot of our ability to make decisions is very much affected by the biases that our brain encourages, that our brain influences. And so this is a huge one. Is that people, and I mean, God, this is like social media 101 right here, right? Is that people are going to look at interesting information more than statistical information. I mean, a lot of that is that there's not a huge emphasis on understanding statistics in kind of the modern educational curriculum. But like, you have so many people that get on TikTok and like diagnose themselves with things and like don't actually look at kind of the statistics that go into like the symptomology and the severity and all of these different things. They're just like, ooh, yeah, that sounds like me. So, and this is a big one too. We see this a lot in our modern society, a lot just in our daily lives, is that we tend to kind of take a stance on something and then not really give that up. And we'll talk a lot about this in conflict, because this becomes a really strong motivator of conflict, is that when conflict tends to get higher, we tend to get more firm in our stance. And we tend to just not listen to reason, to rationality, whatever it is. There's a whole, can't remember where it was, I think it was called The Virtues of Rationality or whatever. A really nice list of like 10 things of like how to live a rational life. It's all about kind of being open to being wrong. And a lot of people are protecting their self-image, their self-biases, by saying like, I'm not going to open myself up to be wrong because I don't like feeling wrong. This is also a really big one, something that we can't easily imagine. We kind of just write off as not being possible or not being true. This is like total left field. I was having a conversation with my wife. So I was walking with my son this morning, and there was a tree crew that were cutting down a tree with a chainsaw. And my wife was like, did you know the chainsaw was invented for like gynecological, like cutting women open? I was like, there's no way. There's like, no, because like, I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, there had to have been lumberjacks cutting down trees before doctors were cutting women open. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. I can't imagine it. And then I looked it up on Google, and like, she was right on the money, right?
Also, a woman invented the
circular saw.
Interesting.
Yes.
An Amish woman. Interesting. That is hard to imagine. I don't believe it, right?
The Amish part or the woman?
Right. The Amish part. Don't hate me. But this one, I mean, all of these are these self-biases that we have. We tend to build up our own self-image, our own kind of confidence, and it's a way of protecting ourselves from feeling wrong, from feeling rejected, right? And so we tend to focus on all the times that we were right, and we kind of ignore all of these times that we were wrong. I think a lot of our identity pushes these ideas, that we have these beliefs about who we are. I'm a good person, and so I tend to see all of these instances where I was a good person, and then when I'm not a good person, then I come up with a story about how it was this just like random event that doesn't really affect how I'm a good person, right? And then you end up forgetting about it.
Situational versus dispositional.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And I think we get a little bit more into that in a future lecture, but this is a big one. And so this very much kind of ties into that whole process. I mean, this is how attention and the brain really works, is that when we have goals, We tend to just look for things that confirm those goals, and I think that a lot of our identity processes are goals inherently, about what we want to accomplish, about who we want to be, and so we tend to kind of just seek out the information that confirms kind of what group we want to be a part of, or what kind of movement or values or whatever we want to be a part of. And often in groups, this is something that is really insidious, that has caused a lot of changes in the way that groups operate, especially at really high levels of government, is that if someone, especially a leader, puts out their preference at the beginning of a meeting, it tends to influence the entire meeting. So everybody is like, oh, well, the leader or the prototypical member kind of took a stance, and so we all kind of have to get in line with that, right? And so there's a lot of movement here to kind of ban public statements about initial preferences on things and to really have an open discussion before you come to any conclusions on things. And then there's a lot of encouragement to kind of be creative and to be kind of open about positions that may be minority positions, to express dissent. This is fascinating. At first look, you might think like this is a process that like splits a group in half and you have one group doing this and one group doing that. This is something a lot different. This is more about a group adopting a very extreme position. You have other groups that might adopt the other position, but this is a very in-group, out-group type phenomenon that happens. And so what kind of comes out, so let's say that you're in a group and you're discussing some type of problem. What tends to happen is that you tend to see that like, okay, this person that's talking just expressed that they have a strong opinion about this. And so the group probably has a really strong opinion about this. And so all of a sudden the group itself ends up taking a much more extreme position than any of the individuals in that group. If you were to go and like do a poll of the prejudices in a group, you'd probably find that none of them were highly prejudiced, but then somehow the group becomes extremely prejudiced because of the discussions that unfold and because of kind of these social comparison processes of thinking that the other people have a much more extreme position and kind of going in that direction. And so this is, like I said, this is very heavily influenced by those initial preferences that are said, right? So if a leader or a prototypical member kind of expresses having a specific issue on something, then all of a sudden the group tends to think like, oh, we need to like shift our entire beliefs in that direction, and it usually shifts in a very strong, extreme direction. This is very, very present in today's culture. I think too, something that's really interesting kind of along those lines is the fact that, I mean, when you're thinking about any of these social issues, there's a lot of gray area, right? But like as a group, as an institution or whatever, you usually have to take a stance one way or the other. And as a part of that group, you then have this pressure to be like, well, the group itself took a stance, and so I have to either go this way or I have to go that way. When in a lot of these cases, there's a ton of ambiguity. There's a bunch of gray area in individual situations that just get completely ignored because of all of this kind of group pressure to conform and to get on the same page about all of these issues. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems with politics in general, is that everything is pitched as this black and white, right or wrong, and there's so much gray to everything that we vote about. So, yeah, so this kind of leads to these kind of risky alternatives, because you're amplifying all of the attitudes towards these really strong opinions about things, these really strong beliefs and values and perceptions. And so this kind of leads groups down this kind of dangerous road towards groupthink, towards anti-conformity, where it's saying like, this is how we are defined now. And so this was another study that was, I guess, kind of similar, but they had strongly prejudiced people discuss issues with other prejudiced individuals, and they became more prejudiced, right? So there was like this shift to the more extreme. But then when they had mildly prejudiced people discussing issues with other mildly prejudiced individuals, it became less pronounced, right? And so this is kind of that polarization that's happening, is that there are these social comparison processes of like trying to fit in with these other people. And so you end up taking these extreme positions on things just because of that social pressure. social comparison, right? And so this is so much about, I mean, there's entire branches of philosophy that focus on the fact that like the vast majority of people make the decisions in their life that they do because of the expectations of the people around them. That it's actually very rare to find people that are doing things out of their own self-interest and out of their own self-motivated desires. And so a lot of that kind of comes into play here with a lot of our decisions about strong social issues and strong moral issues, is that we are comparing the people around us. There's so much like proximity type influence here of like, how does my family feel about this? How do my friends feel about this? How do my coworkers feel about this? And a lot of the times you need to kind of take a particular stance in different situations because of that social pressure, because of that anxiety that comes with taking a stance and rocking the boat. And so this kind of ties back into that polarization issue, is that through these processes, through these social comparison processes, we're trying to figure out kind of what the group norm is. A lot of the times we don't have actual access to that. We have access to the direct people around us, and so we end up kind of just conforming to what they're doing. And oftentimes it ends up being kind of, you think that the group around you has a much higher expectation or a much more extreme position, and so then you kind of take your behavior in that direction as well. And this comes back to the whole initial preferences being said at the very beginning of a discussion. A lot of the times people may have a specific opinion about something, but the actual discussion, the persuasion during the discussion changes their mind, right? And so a lot of the times, because of this kind of circularity here, this kind of leads to more extreme views on things, because you're being persuaded by the group and then you in turn are persuading the group, and then it becomes more and more extreme as the group kind of becomes this echo chamber that starts focusing on these stronger and stronger viewpoints. And this is something that's really salient. If like you have a section at the end of the meeting where you tell everybody to like, let's go back over everything that we just came to a conclusion about, then this process ends up being even more polarized and more extreme, because it's like, let's get clear on what our position on this is as a group. It can be. And then so a lot of this, I mean, almost everything in this class is pitched as kind of a double-edged sword, right? Where it's like, yeah, these can be really good if they're monitored, if they're facilitated the right way, but they can also lead to these really high conformity rates that, because yeah, I think I have a slide coming up about like the positive parts of group polarization, because like there are very good like evolutionary reasons why you'd want these things to exist for particular types of issues. It's when they get used for issues that cause societal harm and harm to others that becomes a little detrimental. So, but this gets into something kind of really detrimental too, is that a lot of the times, and this is something we've talked about before, we're not really listening to the actual argument when people are trying to convince us of something. We're really kind of looking at the consensus of opinion around us. This comes back to the Ash experiment that we talked about earlier in the course, of just kind of conforming to what the other people around us are. Like if you're in a crowd of people and you're watching the speaker say something and you're like, this is totally bullshit. And then you look around and everybody's like, yeah. Like, I mean, my wife and I had this issue with, we've been watching America's Got Talent. And the two of us will look at each other and just be like, that was crap. And all of a sudden they're just like, that was the bloody best thing I've ever seen. And we're just like, God, we are terrible at this. Like, and so this kind of ties into the same issue that we've been talking about. So, but it's from more of an identity kind of process that if we think that the prototypical group member has an extreme attitude, our identity processes are going to have a huge play in this. Because if the group means something, if it's really important to us, then we are going to want to change our position to match the values and the beliefs of what the typical group member actually believes. And when this happens, it causes the diversity to start to drop pretty dramatically. And this leads to some of the negative effects that cohesion can have. But the other part of this that's really interesting is that, and this kind of gets into, I don't know when the slide's coming up, but it gets into that idea of some of the positives of this type of behavior, is that this was originally used to try to differentiate in-groups from out-groups. Taking a stance on something allows you to say, we are different than them. This is what creates our group identity. And it leads to this idea that these echo chambers that we tend to receive things that our in-group members are saying a lot more positively than those that are shared by the out-group members. And so because of this, we end up in this kind of circular pattern of really ramping up these ideas that we have to extremes and taking these extreme positions because we're trying to identify who we are as a group. I think this is super salient in today's political world. Like, this is what it means to be on this side, and this is what it means to be on this side. And most of us are just like, is there like any gray area? Like, really? If I say this, I'm going to be totally stereotyped into this box, and if I say this, I'm going to be in this box. Like, it's not a fun world to live in. So this is the one I was thinking of. So positive consequences of polarization. So, and a lot of this, the researchers have looked like, okay, where did this come from? And does it serve a good purpose, right? And so a lot of it, you want to have extreme caution, especially as like an early tribe, right? Saying like, we need to take drought into consideration, and we need to have an extreme position on whether or not the rain might disappear, even though it might never. But it allows you to have kind of plans in place to know when threats are good ones or not good, or not good ones, but big ones or not. So this is a big one. So this is about these group identity processes, right? So if you're taking these strong opinions on things, it usually is encouraging this kind of optimism of like, we are this group that's trying to accomplish something, that's trying to take a stance on something, and it really drives people to want to be involved and to want to like add to the success of their group. Now, and this one, I'm trying to think of like a good example of this, but because this is something that evolutionarily, it's kind of hard to pin down. I'm trying to think of like where this came from in the textbook, but because usually these are more group oriented. This is kind of talking about positions that may be kind of minority or unexpressed positions, but this could be something that kind of went unnoticed in a group and someone made a big deal out of it. And so it became more of an issue that the group then focused on. So if you kind of go back to the idea of like droughts and threats and big animals, you have someone that was like, we've never really thought about the fact that like all the water can go away, right? And then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh yeah, we need to take a really extreme stance on this and really plan for it. But this is the bad side, right? So this is what we're all trying to avoid. And this, I mean, I just talked about today's political culture. This is what it feels like, honestly, is a really, really strong pressure to conform. It's this fear that we have of taking a stance on something because of all of the stereotypical pressure that's going to be put on us for leaning in one direction or the other. It depends a lot on the kind of environment that you're in, whether it's you're a right person in a left world or a left person in a right world, but these kind of things really pressure individuals into kind of putting a lot of their own personal preferences under the surface and not really expressing them. And so it makes it, these are environments where the cohesiveness and kind of the conformity pressures are so high that everybody is just encouraged to agree with everybody. But yeah, this is kind of a scary process because it's not a world that's fun to live in when you are constantly afraid to express kind of your individuality, and you're constantly afraid of making mistakes. So a big one, the textbook talks a lot about the Bay of Pigs incident, which is like a little dated now, but it was one in which JFK was going to invade Cuba. This was around the Cuban Missile Crisis time, all of this stuff. And all of these, they had these groups that came together. JFK would always talk about what needed to be done right at the beginning of the meeting. He wanted everybody on board, wanted everybody to do the right thing. And there were a lot of people in the room that were like, this is a stupid idea. Like, this is not going to work. There are so many reasons why this isn't going to work. And none of them spoke up because they were afraid to disagree with kind of the direction that things were going. They were afraid to be viewed as this kind of other stereotypical person. And it ended up being an extreme disaster. But the cool thing that we'll kind of look at more is that JFK actually took a completely different direction after that happened and changed everything about the way that he held meetings in kind of accordance to the things that we're going to talk about here, right? So the three kind of sets for setting the stage for groupthink are cohesion, which, like I said, we've talked a lot about being a really good thing, but it's this kind of double-edged sword. Structural faults in the organization of the group, which we'll kind of look at kind of individual components of in a second. But the big one here is these really provocative situational contexts, which I think are extremely salient in today's world. There's some crisis happening every 2 months that's like, care, get on board, right? And I think a lot of these are manufactured to get us to care. That's what kind of the whole media machine is all about, is convincing you that we're in a provocative situational context, that if we don't do this, then the whole world's going to fall apart, right? That really pushes a lot of these pressures. So the symptoms, so how do you know that you're in a group that's like fighting groupthink? And I mean, I'm pitching a lot of these as being very societal in nature, but this can happen in very small groups as well, in companies, in team sports, all of these different kind of things. A big one is overestimating what your group is capable of. So, and oftentimes people in these groups think that everything is just fine. And they're often unaware or unable to even consider that there may be problems with the way that things are being done. So, and that's where this kind of strong sense of confidence, this strong sense of power kind of play in. But there's this enthusiasm. I mean, going back to the Bay of Pigs idea, like everybody was like, yeah, let's do it. Even though a lot of people thought that it was kind of a stupid idea. So this is a big one. This is something we've talked about before with conformity, that high pressures to conform kind of shut down people's ability to consider alternatives, to mention alternatives. But this one is kind of coming back to this societal level, is something that I think we see a lot in today's world too, is that we are categorizing people in very simplistic, stereotypical ways. And this is what makes it really scary to express yourself in certain situations where you might get put in one of these boxes, right? It's like, if I take a stance on this, they're gonna think that I have the same stances on all of this other stuff, right? When it may be that, like, look, I care about this in this way, and I care about that in this way, and I care about this in this way. People are not simple. These ideas are not black and white. A lot of this stuff is gray. But this is something that tends to come out of these types of situations, is that we create these extreme stereotypes. We make these people look scary. We make them look stupid. Pressures towards uniformity. So this is, again, kind of these conforming pressures. Everybody should be acting the same way. Everybody should have the same beliefs. Everybody should have the same values. There's a ton of interpersonal pressure. And this is one of those things where it's like, it's really easy to be like, yeah, I believe that too, but then it's really, really hard to present any type of evidence against that. You get so much pushback for even questioning the way that people kind of think about things. You can think about these echo chambers in social media that really influence this, that drive this constant agreement with one another. But there's often really harsh stuff that comes out of this. Personal attacks, making people feel worthless, making people feel like they should never have had that thought in the first place. There's a lot of ostracism kind of techniques that go in here, of making people feel like they're not included because they have different opinions. So when we look at the causes, cohesiveness is a really interesting one because, like I said, kind of numerous times, this is one that we view as being a really good thing. This is something that, like, at the beginning of this class, I pitched as being the health meter of a group, right? If you're super cohesive, you're a really healthy group. You perform well, you're super efficient. The people in your group are super satisfied. And so this is where kind of the insidiousness of this comes in, and the reason that a lot of the people in these groupthink situations don't really think that anything is going wrong, because it feels super cohesive. And so what happens is that cohesiveness is not something that leads to groupthink. It's something that has to be there along with these other ones. And so something you can look for is this, once you've gotten to a level where disagreements are just like non-existent, that's a pretty good indicator that you're on the path if these other things start to show up. And so these structural faults, a big one is this kind of pressure to conform. And a lot of that comes from the leadership. So making certain people look like bad people if they don't kind of get in line with what the group agrees on and what the group thinks about. But I mean, I can think of tons of instances of like romantic relationships where there's an extremely high pressure to conform, right? And a lot of the times it's from one person to the other person yields a lot. They don't really kind of push back on certain issues. They kind of just push everything under the rug and try to keep the boat from rocking. That's very similar to a lot of this stuff, right? And I think too, because of that, like think about situations, think about like married couples that may be in a situation like this. We're talking about decision making, right? And so you have this super high pressure to conform. You have one of the members of that relationship is afraid to disagree, and you're talking about finances. You're talking about buying a house. You're talking about buying a car. And you have one person that's like, I don't think we have enough money to do that. And the other person's like, no, we do. Don't worry about it. Okay. But oftentimes the person saying like, we don't have enough money probably isn't even going to voice that because they're so afraid of disagreeing, right? So it is very similar. Yeah. There's different levels of kind of harm that can happen at different kind of sizes and different power of the group. And so the provocative situational context is one that I kind of hinted at. So these are ones where we're convinced that there's high stakes, right? That everything's going to fall apart if we don't make the right decision. And the right decision is usually posed as a moral decision where you're a bad person if you don't get in line with what we think. So, gotcha. Yeah, so I was trying to remember what that one said. So this is actually a tactic that's often used in these types of situations, is that they kind of prey on low self-esteem and these histories of mistakes and things like this to really kind of enforce a lot of these ideas and to get people in line. And so that kind of becomes one of the things that leads to these situations. I mean, any context that provokes fear, right? I can think of two examples just in the last couple of months from both sides, right? You have the Mar-a-Lago raid that just happened on Trump's house, right? You have the right is up in arms about that and is saying like this is going to just destroy the kind of trust in our procedural justice, all of these things. Then you also have the abortion stuff that just happened in the Supreme Court, right? Like the left is, and a lot of people on the right as well, but a lot of them are saying like, look, this is going to destroy the fabric of the Supreme Court and how we make laws and do all of these things. And those types of framings, those provocative kind of situational like ways of looking at it really reinforce, and this is a voting tactic, right? And I'm not saying that like the abortion bill was for voting or the Mar-a-Lago raid was because of some political thing or whatever, but the idea is the way that you frame these increases group identity, right? If you convince people that what's happening on the other side is going to destroy us, everybody gets out and votes, right? And so the media is very much involved in this whole part. So when we're looking at the kind of emergence itself, so those are things that can cause it, but this is something that I've already kind of hinted at, that this is something that is usually already there and is not really a bad thing until some of these other ones start to really come into play. And so a big one is kind of the leaders really making their preferences known at the beginning. This also really happens with leaders that have a really strong need for power, a need for control. They want to get everybody in line and get everybody to conform. This was those quotes that I put up from like Hitler and God, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but about kind of what? Ho Chi Minh, yep. About molding people into what they wanted to mold them into. That's what a lot of this comes from. But the provocative situational context, the thing that I haven't really mentioned before that's a huge part of this is the time pressure, right? Things are going to fall apart. We only have this much time. Everybody get in line right now. Let's make a quick snap decision right now. And this is a very strong internal, like politic type, like strategy of getting everybody really freaked out. I mean, this is, I don't know how young all of you were for 9/11, but this, yeah, there were a lot of bills that were passed right after 9/11 that were very long, that none of the senators really had time to read, but there was a time pressure. There was, the world is going to end, we need to pass these things, we need to vote right now, and that causes these decisions to be made. I'm not saying that these are like bad decisions or whatever, but it leads to really bad decision-making strategies. So I think this is the last one. We're running on time right now, but so this is something I mentioned, the Bay of Pigs incident, and this is something that afterwards JFK took a huge interest in the research around a lot of this stuff and really tried to change the entire way that he approached leadership. And so he actually was known after that incident to stop stating his personal beliefs at the beginning of each session. He would open things up for discussion. He would hear what everybody had to say, and then he would kind of make his position known on it all. He wanted full discussions. He wanted to hear all the pros and cons. And I mean, it's kind of obvious when you have like one of the worst military blunders in US history. It's like, yeah, maybe I should hear the bad stuff, right? This is a big one that's not common in leadership that should be. And honestly, I think a lot of it is not necessarily the leader's fault, but is a lot of, kind of, it might be, but you need to be in an environment where you feel, as someone that's a subordinate, someone that's under a leader, that you actually feel safe criticizing them in a healthy way, right? Because the leader, I mean, one of the slides we had in Power was all about like the corruption of power. People become very egotistical, right, when they end up in these power situations, and it's sometimes nice to take them down a few pegs and make them realize that they're still human. This was a big one too. So this was one that JFK did a lot, was he actually arranged for all of these groups to meet without him, and then he would meet with individuals from those groups to kind of see what the take was. But devil's advocate approach is also really big. So someone doesn't have to actually have a different opinion, but they should kind of take one on to make people think about the alternatives that people aren't thinking about. And so from the group perspective, it's often really nice to split people into subgroups. And the key word here is smaller. Smaller the group, the less influential pressure there is. And so it actually allows people to express themselves more fully. This is a big one. You should probably verify independent statements. This is a kind of contentious issue in today's world because fact checking is usually checking facts that aren't right or wrong answers. It's like a lot of the fact checking that goes on is about studies that have been done or this or that, and a lot of these studies are based on statistical probabilities. If you look up, I was listening to a philosophy podcast the other day that kind of got into this a little bit, and it was just like, if you go on Google right now and you look up asparagus good for me, you're going to find a ton of articles about how asparagus is good for you. If you look up asparagus bad for me, you're going to find a ton of articles about asparagus being bad for you. And so this is kind of a tricky one because we live in a world where there's a lot of differing conclusions based on the statistics that you use to get there. But the biggest one here is encouraging dissent. This is something I've mentioned 100 times in the class so far, is that you need a safe, open environment where people can feel like they can actually question the way that the group is going. So, cool. That is the end of the lecture.